It didn't start with a declaration of war, no speeches, no headlines screaming conflict, just a sudden flash in the Iraqi sky, a drone, then another, then an airstrike that wasn't supposed to happen. And within minutes, everything changed because what just happened inside Iraq may have quietly opened a second front in the most dangerous conflict on earth right now, the growing shadow war between the United States and Iran. But here's the part no one is talking about. This wasn't random. This wasn't isolated. This was coordinated. And if you look closely, you'll realize something chilling. Iraq is no longer just a battleground, it's becoming the center of something much bigger. For years, Iraq has been walking a tightrope, caught between two powerful forces. On one side, the United States, with military bases, advisors, and air power still deeply embedded across the country. On the other, Iran, with influence that runs far deeper than just politics, through militias, networks, and shadow alliances that operate in silence. And for a long time, this fragile balance somehow held. Tension, yes, threats, constant but controlled, until now. Because over the last few days, something shifted. Suddenly, reports began surfacing unidentified drones flying over strategic zones, explosions near military linked positions, airstrikes hitting targets that officially don't exist. And here's where it gets even more dangerous. No one is fully claiming responsibility, which means one thing: this is no longer direct warfare. This is deniable escalation, and that's far more dangerous. Think about it. When countries fight openly, there are rules, limits, signals, warnings. But when no one claims the strike, when everything happens in the shadows, that's when mistakes happen. That's when lines get crossed and without anyone realizing it until it's too late. Now, here's the question that changes everything. Why Iraq? Why now? Because if this conflict was only about the US and Iran, you'd expect the tension to explode in obvious places: the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, direct naval encounters. But instead, it's happening in Iraq. And that's not accidental. Iraq offers something neither side has anywhere else: access, positioning, and most importantly, plausible deniability. Inside Iraq, actions can be carried out through proxies, groups that don't officially represent any government, but are deeply connected behind the scenes, which means Iran can apply pressure without direct confrontation. The US can respond without declaring escalation. And in between, a country that becomes the battlefield without choosing to be one. But here's where it gets even more intense, because what we're seeing right now isn't just random strikes. There's a pattern, a sequence. First, surveillance drones, then targeted attacks, then responses that don't look like responses. It's like both sides are testing something, testing limits, testing reactions, testing how far they can go without triggering something irreversible. And history tells us this kind of testing never stays limited because every test creates a new baseline. Every strike normalizes the next one. And before anyone realizes it, the unthinkable becomes routine. Now, pause for a second, because this is where things get uncomfortable. What if this isn't just escalation? What if this is preparation? Think about the timing. Tensions between the US and Iran have already been rising across multiple regions. Naval movements, economic pressure, warnings from officials on both sides, and suddenly Iraq starts heating up. That's not coincidence. That's positioning, because in any major conflict, you don't just fight where it's obvious. You open multiple fronts, you stretch your opponent, you create pressure points. And right now, Iraq is starting to look exactly like that: a pressure point, a second front, a place where the real battle hasn't fully begun, but is already taking shape. But here's the part that should really concern you: the people inside Iraq didn't choose this, and yet they're the ones closest to the fire. Because when drones fly overhead, when strikes happen without warning, when retaliation comes without confirmation, there's no clear enemy, there's no safe side, only uncertainty. And uncertainty is where conflicts spiral the fastest. Now let's go deeper, because what just happened is only the surface. Behind these strikes, there are signals, messages being sent, not to the public, but to each other. And if you decode those signals, you start to see something even more dangerous forming, something that suggests this isn't just a reaction, it's a strategy. But before we break that down, you need to understand one critical detail that most people are missing. These drone strikes weren't just about destruction, they were about precision, and precision changes everything because it tells us this isn't chaos, this is controlled escalation. And controlled escalation, Reiko, can quickly become uncontrollable. So the real question is, if this is only the beginning, what happens when someone pushes just a little too far? What happens when a strike hits the wrong target, or worse, the right one? Because if Iraq truly becomes the second front in this conflict, then what comes next won't stay contained. And in part two, we're going to uncover the hidden signals behind these strikes, the players operating in the shadows, and the one move that could turn this quiet escalation into a full scale regional crisis. And trust me, once you see it, you won't look at this conflict the same way again. What if I told you the drones you just saw, the strikes that lit up the Iraqi sky, weren't actually the most important part of this story? Because the real story is who didn't take credit. In most conflicts, responsibility is power. You strike, you claim it, you send a message. But here, silence. And that silence is not weakness, it's strategy. Because in Iraq, war doesn't move in straight lines, it moves through layers. Governments on the surface, militias underneath, and behind them, networks that don't officially exist. And right now, those networks are activating. Let's break something down that most people completely miss. When a drone hits a target in Iraq, it doesn't just happen. It requires surveillance, coordination, access to airspace, and intelligence that is extremely precise. So when we see repeated strikes hitting specific positions, we're not looking at chaos, we're looking at a system. And here's where things start to get uncomfortable. Because many of the groups operating inside Iraq today aren't just random militias, they are deeply embedded, highly organized, and in many cases, aligned, not publicly, but strategically. Some operate under the banner of resistance, others claim to defend sovereignty, but behind the scenes, they act as pressure points, levers, triggers. Now imagine this: instead of two countries fighting directly, they fight through these groups. One side applies pressure, the other responds, but neither side officially steps into the ring. That's what makes this moment so dangerous, because it creates a situation where escalation happens without accountability. And right now, that's exactly what we're seeing. Over the last few days, something unusual has been noticed by analysts watching the region closely. The strikes are becoming more targeted, the timing is becoming more coordinated, and the responses are becoming more calculated. This is not random retaliation. This is communication. Every drone launch, every explosion, every unclaimed strike is sending a message, not to the public, but to the other side. Messages like, we can reach you. We know your positions. We're watching. But here's the twist that changes everything. Some of these messages aren't just warnings, they're tests. Think about it. If you wanted to understand your opponent's limits, you wouldn't start a full scale war. You'd probe, push, observe the reaction. And that's exactly what's happening inside Iraq right now. Both sides are testing each other without crossing the line that triggers total conflict. But here's the problem with testing limits: eventually, you find one. And when that happens, things don't de escalate, they snap. Now let's zoom in even closer, because there's one detail that analysts are quietly paying attention to, and it could explain why this escalation is happening now. Locations. Not just that strikes are happening, but where they're happening. Some of the recent activity has been reported near areas that are strategically sensitive, zones connected to logistics routes, supply chains, positions that matter, not just locally, but regionally, which means this might not just be about retaliation, it might be about positioning for something bigger. Because in modern conflict, control of territory isn't always about land, it's about access. Who controls movement? Who controls supply? Who controls the ability to strike or defend? And Iraq sits right in the middle of that equation. Now ask yourself this: if you were preparing for a larger confrontation, wouldn't you want to secure your position first? Wouldn't you want to weaken your opponent's access points? Wouldn't you want to test your capabilities before things go fully public? That's exactly what this looks like. And here's where things get even more intense, because there are signs that this activity isn't isolated to just one region inside Iraq. It's spreading different areas. different actors, but the same pattern, which suggests something chilling. This is not a single operation. This is a network-wide activation. And once a network like that is active, it doesn't just stop. Now let's talk about the United States for a moment, because while much of this activity is happening in the shadows, the US isn't blind to it. In fact, there are indications that the US is already adjusting, quietly, strategically, without making it obvious, because responding too openly could trigger exactly what they're trying to avoid, a direct confrontation. So instead, they respond in ways that are harder to detect: precision over power, signals over statements. But that creates a dangerous loop, because when both sides are trying to stay just below the threshold, they can't fully control how the other interprets their actions. And that's where misunderstandings begin. One strike is seen as a warning, the other side sees it as escalation. One movement is meant as defense, the other side reads it as preparation for attack. And suddenly, both sides think the other's going further than they actually are. That's how conflicts spiral, not always through intention, but through perception. Now, here's the moment where everything could shift, because there's one scenario, one very real possibility, right, that could instantly turn this shadow conflict into something far more dangerous. What if one of these strikes doesn't hit a proxy target? What if it hits something directly tied to the United States or directly linked to Iran? No ambiguity, no deniability, no gray zone, just a clear line crossed, because once that happens, the entire structure of controlled escalation collapses. And when that structure collapses, there's no more testing, no more signals, no more shadows, only response. And that response could come faster than anyone expects. So now we're standing at a critical point. The network is active, the signals are being sent, the testing is ongoing, but the system holding it all together is fragile. And in part three, we're going to explore what happens when that system breaks, the scenarios that could trigger a rapid escalation, the chain reactions that could follow, and why this second front in Iraq might be the place where everything finally explodes. Because once we cross that line, there's no going back. There's a moment in every conflict, a moment so small, so fast, that most people don't even notice it when it happens. But everything after that moment is different, because that's the point where the line disappears. Right now, Iraq is sitting on that line. And the truth is, we may already be closer to crossing it than anyone realizes. Because up until now, everything we've seen, the drones, the airstrikes, the shadow responses, has existed inside a very fragile system. A system built on one idea: keep it controlled, keep it deniable, keep it below the threshold. But what happens when something breaks that system? Let's walk through the first scenario, and this is the one that analysts fear the most. Scenario one: the wrong target strike. Imagine this: a drone is launched, precise, calculated, just like the others. It's meant to hit a militia position, a signal, a warning, but something goes wrong. Maybe the intelligence is slightly off. Maybe the target moved. Maybe the strike hits closer than expected. And suddenly, American personnel are caught in the blast. Now everything changes, because this is no longer a shadow message. This is direct. At that moment, the United States has two choices: absorb the hit and risk looking weak, respond forcefully and risk escalation. History tells us what usually happens. Force is answered with force. And if the US responds directly, it doesn't just hit back, it hits harder, more precise, more visible, more undeniable, which leads to the next reaction from the other side. And just like that, the controlled game of signals turns into something far more dangerous: a cycle of retaliation. Now, here's where it escalates even faster than people expect, because in Iraq, you're not dealing with just one group, you're dealing with a network. So when one group responds, others may follow, not because they were ordered to, but because the pressure demands it. And suddenly, one strike becomes five, five becomes 10, different locations, different actors, same direction. And in the middle of all that chaos, it becomes almost impossible to tell who is acting on orders, who is acting independently, and who is pushing things further than intended. That's how escalation becomes uncontrollable. Now let's move to the second scenario, because this one is quieter, but just as dangerous. Scenario two: the misread signal. Not every escalation begins with a strike. Sometimes it begins with a misunderstanding. Imagine this: the US increases surveillance, more drones, more flights, more presence in the air. From their perspective, it's defensive, monitoring, precaution. But from the other side, it looks like preparation for something bigger. So what do? They act first, a preemptive strike, not because they want escalation, but because they believe it's already coming. And now, both sides think they're reacting, but in reality, they're both escalating. This is one of the most dangerous dynamics in modern conflict because no one thinks they started it, but everyone is responding. And once that loop begins, it feeds itself. Now, here's where Iraq becomes even more critical because of its geography, its positioning, its connections to the wider region. If escalation accelerates inside Iraq, it doesn't stay inside Iraq, it spreads. Scenario three, the regional chain reaction. Let's say strikes intensify, more targets, more frequency, more visibility. Other players start watching closely and they begin asking one question: are we next? Because in a region as interconnected as the Middle East, no conflict exists in isolation. Alliances are complex, lines are blurred, and when one front heats up, others don't stay cold for long. So, what happens next? Groups in neighboring areas become more alert, more reactive, more willing to act. Suddenly, the pressure spreads beyond Iraq, and now the conflict has multiple flashpoints, multiple triggers, multiple risks. This is how a second front becomes something bigger, not just an extension of conflict, but a multiplier. And here's the most dangerous part of all this: once multiple fronts are active, control becomes nearly impossible because now you're not managing one situation, you're managing several, each with its own risks, each with its own actors, each capable of triggering something larger. Now, step back for a moment. Look at everything we've just walked through: a wrong strike, a misread signal, a regional chain reaction. None of these require a full scale decision. None of these require an official declaration. They can all happen inside the system we're already seeing, which means this isn't a distant possibility, it's a real time risk. And right now, Iraq is sitting right at the center of it. But here's the final twist: because even in the middle of all this escalation, there's still one question that hasn't been answered. Is this intentional? Are both sides trying to avoid a full scale conflict, or are they slowly moving toward it without saying it out loud? Because if this is controlled, then there's still a chance to contain it. But if it's not, if this is a gradual buildup, a quiet positioning for something bigger, then what we're seeing in Iraq right now isn't the escalation, it's the beginning. And in part four, we're going to confront the biggest question of all: where does this go next? The possible endgames, the global consequences, and the moment that could turn this from a shadow war into a conflict the entire world feels. Because if this second front fully ignites, it won't stay in the shadows. There's a dangerous illusion surrounding everything we've just seen, an illusion that this is still controllable, that the drones will stay silent, that the strikes will stay limited, that Iraq will remain just a pressure zone, not a full battlefield. But history tells a different story because conflicts like this don't explode all at once. They evolve quietly, step by step, until one day there's no shadow left to hide behind. Right now, the United States and Iran are still operating in that gray space. No official war, no direct confrontation, no clear red line that's been publicly crossed. But underneath that calm surface, the structure holding everything together is weakening. And the moment that structure breaks, everything accelerates. So let's confront the final question: where does this go next? Possibility one, controlled conflict, the long shadow war. There is a scenario where both sides continue exactly like this: careful strikes, limited responses, calculated signals, a long term shadow war, fought through proxies, managed through pressure, contained, but never resolved. In this version, Iraq becomes a permanent second front, not a battlefield of massive invasions, but a constant zone of tension: drones overhead, targets struck in silence, messages sent without words. To the outside world, it looks unstable, but behind the scenes, it's controlled because both sides understand the cost of going further. But here's the problem with controlled conflict: it requires perfect discipline, perfect timing, perfect understanding of the other side's limits, and no system stays perfect forever, which leads us to the second possibility. Possibility 2, the sudden break. This is the moment everything changes. It could be one strike, one miscalculation, one decision made under pressure, a target that matters too much, a loss that can't be ignored, a signal that's taken the wrong way, and suddenly the rules disappear. No more deniability, no more shadows, just direct, undeniable action. In this scenario, Iraq doesn't remain a second front. It becomes the first visible battlefield. Air power increases, strikes become open, forces reposition, and the world watches as something that was once hidden becomes impossible to ignore. But even that isn't the most dangerous outcome, because there's a third possibility. Possibility 3, the cascade effect. This is the scenario that keeps strategists awake at night because it doesn't stop with Iraq. Remember what we talked about earlier. This region is connected deeply. So if escalation breaks out in Iraq, it sends signals far beyond its borders, signals that activate responses elsewhere, more fronts, more actors, more pressure. And suddenly, you're not looking at a single conflict anymore. You're looking at a regional crisis. Shipping routes become unstable. Energy markets react. Global powers start paying closer attention because now the risk isn't just regional, it's global. And here's the moment where everything becomes real, when multiple fronts are active, when multiple actors are involved, when multiple miscalculations are happening at the same time. Control doesn't just weaken, it disappears. And that's when conflicts stop being predictable. Now, let's bring this back to where we started: a drone in the sky, an airstrike that wasn't supposed to happen, a moment that most people barely noticed. But now you understand what it could mean, because Iraq is no longer just caught in the middle. It's becoming something else entirely: a testing ground, a pressure point, a second front that could become the main stage. And the most unsettling part: this may already be in motion, not officially, not publicly, not in a way that triggers headlines big enough for everyone to stop and realize, but in patterns, in signals, in quiet escalations that are building something underneath the surface. So the next time you hear about a drone strike in Iraq, or an explosion that no one claims, or a report that seems too small to matter, like, remember this: these are not isolated events. These are pieces of a larger picture, and that picture is still forming. The question is no longer, is something happening? The question is, how far will it go before the world is forced to see it? Because when shadows turn into war, it doesn't feel sudden. It feels like something that was always coming. And by the time everyone realizes it, it's already too late to stop.